especially right now in this internet and social media space. Kind of a fair assessment is almost like we've created a monster and now we're trying to somehow wrangle this thing and get it controlled so that it doesn't hurt our kids. As soon as they established an account as a teenager, male or female, predatory adults came like cockroaches. And, the lights out and the cockroaches come out and started interacting with those fake accounts. So it's really an issue. We're going to talk about really two things. First, what Florida did, HB 3, House Bill 3. It was a bill that they passed, and there's a couple things that are extremely, I think, clever about this bill. And just one thing that I'm impressed by is how quick it got passed. But I look at the Kids Online Safety Act, known as KOSA. They're really starting to pick this bill apart and get really in the weeds. And I don't know, maybe that is needed, but the bottom line is, as they do that, nothing is happening and our children are still at risk. The social media experience is vastly different for adults than it is for children.
There is, in my opinion, there's no perfect legislation on any of this stuff because we're dealing with an animal, we're dealing with a genie so far out of the bottle. What I like about the Florida law is that it at least pushes some of the responsibility to the parents. It drives parents toward being more involved to whatever degree in their kids' involvement with social media.
There's beer in every single grocery store in LA County where I live. But what happens when a 13-year-old goes in there and takes a case of beer and puts it on the conveyor belt, right?
Right.
In a modern grocery store, as soon as that item is scanned, the computer locks the conveyor belt. And nothing's going to happen until an ID is scanned. And whoop, the ID is scanned, the computer decides if it's appropriate to continue with the sale, and it happens. But yet, on social media, we can have a 13-year-old accessing whatever they want because there's no accessibility controls. What the lawmakers were smart enough to do is to say, you might be saying you don't know how old these people are, but we think you really do know, and you're going to be responsible based on how you're targeting them. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Truth Nation. My name is Bill Bodner. Sitting across from me, and he's pretty far. The table's pretty big today. What is it, 2,800 miles, 3,000 miles?
It's about 2,200
Oh.
miles, Bill, but it's still too close to California, but it's a
Right.
starting.
You can't get
point.
much further. The chief, Mark Garrett. How is everything, Mark? How is Florida these days? We're going to talk a little bit about Florida today.
Yeah, we are actually.
Yeah.
And I tell people all the time, I'm biased in favor of Florida. There is no perfect place in the world, but what we love it here. We love
Good.
it here.
Yeah, and that is true. That, hey, I'm California. I love the weather. Although lately we were just talking before you jumped on about hey, in California, crazy weather is rain and 50 degrees. That's,
Mhm.
Everyone's in a panic because it's raining and it's 50 degrees. Today, Mark, I am going to try, at least from my point, this is a tough subject for me to talk about because to me, it's akin to the old saying, threading the needle. I'm going to try to, at least from my perspective, try to thread the needle because these are three things that are incredibly important to me. And I feel like they're incredibly important to our country and our future. But to some extent, they are somewhat mutually exclusive, meaning the more you go to one side, you move away from the other side. Here's what those three things are. We're going to talk about online safety for children, but here's the three issues that come into it where we have to find this balance. Freedom of choice. I am a huge believer in personal freedoms and the freedom of people to choose what they do and how they do it. Of course, there's limitations on that, Mark, right? Second thing is child safety, especially right now in this internet and social media space. Kind of a fair assessment is almost like we've created a monster and now we're trying to somehow wrangle this thing and get it controlled so that it doesn't hurt our kids. So child safety is a big part of it. And then finally, privacy. I am a huge proponent of privacy, of the ability that people have in this country to keep things private. when you try to blend all those things together and come up with what I guess would be called a proper social media program or platform for kids, it becomes extremely challenging, right? Well,
That's an understatement.
yeah,
I couldn't agree with you more. I
yeah.
couldn't agree with you more.
So why talk about this today? First off, I think in episode 6, I think we did a story on Snapchat and drug trafficking. Really, it was drug trafficking on all social media. We talked about an experiment, at least as documented in court papers, that a parent did where they posed as a teenage girl. I don't remember the age. I want to say maybe 14 or 16.
Yeah, I think 14. I could be wrong.
And what's interesting is since that time, I've seen actually a lot of stories about people who, I don't know, maybe they said that can't be true. Well, and they've tried it themselves and they've gotten similar results where as soon as they established an account as a teenager, male or female, predatory adults came like cockroaches and the lights out and the cockroaches come out and started interacting with those fake accounts. So it's really an issue. We're going to talk about really two things. First, or let's say first we discuss what Florida did. HB3, House Bill 3. It was a bill that they passed, and you know what, there's a couple things that are extremely, I think, clever about this bill. And just one thing that I'm impressed by is how quick it got passed. I think it was introduced in January sometime of this year, if I'm not mistaken. Maybe there was
Yeah.
prior versions, Mark, that you
Yeah, I think there were some revisions.
okay.
I believe so. Yeah.
Okay, but I look at the Kids Online Safety Act, known as KOSA, and this thing's been kind of floating around for a couple of years in our government, several revisions. The latest one, maybe last May, so we're in April now. We're coming up on a year. That's been floating around. It hasn't been voted on yet. It's very contentious, and we'll talk about the pros and cons of it. And again, as I kind of said at the beginning, uh, I don't love KOSA, but I support it because I feel like we need to do something. And, I think you've said in the past, Mark, something the effect, don't let perfection stop you from progress. Or what is that saying, Mark?
You know
Don't let
what?
the
I couldn't even
pursuit of
quote my.
perfection, yeah, don't let the pursuit of perfection stop you from making progress. In other words, like they're really starting to pick this bill apart and get really in the weeds. And I don't know, maybe that is needed, but the bottom line is as they do that, nothing is happening and our children are still at risk. I know maybe to start up, Mike, I know you, Mark, I know you have a school age child. How do you handle social media in your house? Like
Mhm.
what do you do? What restrictions do you do or are there restrictions or how are you comfortable with your child's use of social media?
I'm not.
Yeah,
I mean, I couldn't put any simpler than that. I'm not comfortable with it at all. I'll be honest with you. I'm 60 years old. I'm not even comfortable with my own use of social media
right.
because it's a conduit to so many nefarious behaviors and nefarious individuals. But obviously, you and I are on it. We do podcasts, Bill, and you make our comments and our tweets or whatever they call it on X now, and things like this. So with my son, who's 10 years old,
Mhm.
just turned 10 years old, we hear a lot about from him, not in a really aggressive or whiny way, but sometimes he'll just mention about, oh, these kids have their phones in the classroom. They have to turn them off when they bring them in, or if they put them in a basket when they bring them in, whatever it is to the classroom. Again, this is fourth grade, and he doesn't have a phone. So
Right.
that's how we deal with it right now, as far is him specifically without any physical, like we're there watching supervision. He simply does not have a phone, doesn't even have a one you can just text or call with. And by the way, that's not a bad idea. It's something I'm seriously considering right now, just for safety and convenience purposes, that he can communicate with us when he's not physically with us. Now, at home, it's not that he's not exposed to social media, but that is only in the presence of his mom or his
Mhm.
dad, or both of us. So we'll pick and choose what funny videos he can watch, or how he can correspond with his aunt or his grandmother or things like this, or his best friend, back home or something like that. So it's very limited and it's all under direct supervision. So there's no footprint of him himself being on social media, other than maybe a photo he sends, things like that, which is bad enough, that we'll send for him.
Mhm.
So, that to answer that specific question, that's how we deal with it right now. I know kids that are quite a bit younger than him. How much younger can you be when you're only 10 years old? but there are kids that are a couple of years younger than him or three that are already on social media.
Yeah.
And I find that strange. I
Yeah.
find that dangerous. I find it um, less than responsible for parents to allow their kids to actually be on social media at that age.
Two things on that, Mark. And I hope parents are listening to this. And if they should be aware of this, the social media experience is vastly different for adults than it is for children. Meaning that I like what I just heard you say. And I'm assuming when you talked about the limited interface your son has with social media, it's through an account that you have. It's not an account that's, is it an account that's in his name?
No,
Or no, and I think that's the right way to do it because once the social media platforms provided, let me put it this way, they provide a very different experience for adults than they do for children. So your child, just by using the quote adult experience that's presented on your account, what he's exposed to is going to be significantly safer in my experience than what he would be exposed to if you would let him create his own account. So that's something that's, I like that. Second thing, interesting, I heard you say, like, yeah, there's some, I don't want to say pushback from him. You said how it is, but I have a pretty good friend who has a son who's 14. Mark, he's the only student in his class that doesn't have Snapchat. He's not allowed to use the app Snapchat. The only student in his class. And now my friend is he's staying strong, I guess is the word, but he's starting to question it because it's almost his child is almost being bullied a little bit or made fun of because he's the only one that doesn't have this thing. And his son doesn't understand why he doesn't have it. Kids don't understand the danger, the predators that are out there, or what this experience is. So that's the other side of it is does it
mhm,
have a psychological effect by them being the only person that doesn't have this platform? Let's talk about the Florida law a little bit, Mark. A couple things that I highlighted from it. And when, I just mentioned a 14-year-old, you spoke about a 10-year-old. Under the Florida law, minors younger than 14 years old would be prohibited from establishing an account. Okay. So if you're under 14, you cannot establish a social media account. If you're 14 or 15, you can establish an account with the consent of a parent or guardian. Now, I got to say, like, I find this a little bit strange, and I'm hoping you can point me in the right direction here. And here's why I say that.
mm,
Like, if you're saying that these platforms are inherently harmful to children, okay? If that's the premise, and maybe it's not, but if that's the premise, how can a parent waive that harm? In other words, it's not up to a parent to decide whether their 15-year-old wears a seatbelt in a car, right, Mark? You can't waive that. You can't say like, "Hey, I'm the parent. It's okay. I'm willing to take the risk, and my child doesn't have to wear a seatbelt," right?
mhm. Right.
So my question is, if there's a lot of information out there, or a lot of points of view out there, or rhetoric that suggests that these platforms are inherently unsafe for kids. Well, if they are inherently unsafe for kids, then how can a parent waive that and what good does supervision do? If on the other hand, they could be safe, if what we're saying is it's dangerous for these platforms to be used without supervision, then I can see this part of the law where if you're 14 or 15, a parent can say, yes, it's okay. It's okay for my child to engage in this because I'm going to take the responsibility to supervise them online. What do you think of that? Is there something there where, like, at what point can a parent say, no, that's okay for my child if the experts are saying, no, that's not okay no matter what?
Yeah. Well, it's a very broad, question. If it's an important one, Bill, it's really important. Let me cut to the bottom line on
Yeah.
this, and I'll backtrack a little bit and fill the blanks in, hopefully. There is, in my opinion, there's no perfect legislation on any of this stuff because we're dealing with an animal, we're dealing with a genie so far out of the bottle. It's so intertwined in every fiber of everything that we do. If you're on social media, and almost everybody is
Mhm.
to one extent or another, there's not going to be any legislation, whether it's at the state or federal level, that checks all the boxes that, and by the way, I agree with you. Those are three great points you made earlier: the freedom of choice, child safety, and privacy. Not any legislation is going to check every one of those boxes in a way that we would say, okay, it's perfect. It's not possible. But
Right.
here's the thing. That's true for any parent rearing a child 20 years ago or 50 years ago. In other words, as parents, you're never going to check every correct box when you're rearing a child. Going to do the right thing every time, make the perfect decision, the pursuit of raising a good person. However, what I like about the Florida law is that it at least pushes some of the responsibility to the parents. It drives parents toward being more involved to whatever degree in their kids' involvement with social media. Okay, you can't be on it all under 14 years old, 14 or 15 years old. You have to have your parents' permission. Does that mean it's a perfect solution? Absolutely not. But when I say that and use the example of seatbelts, so look, seatbelts now, by the way, that's a whole different can of worms about the government being able to force you to wear a seatbelt if you don't want to, things like that. A whole different discussion. However, the empirical data with safety restraints is not disputable. Simple as that. They do save lives. Like I'm doing a commercial here of the California Highway Patrol,
Right.
but
That's what I
seatbelts
was going to
save
say that a
lives.
minute ago, right?
Yeah. So at least there, even if there is a civil liberties discussion about adults having to wear seatbelts and then being forced to have their children wear seatbelts. At least there's data that says it's tangible, it's indisputable that it makes life safer for everybody involved. Here's a little bit different story, but other examples. There are age restrictions and sometimes parents' involvement, but just age restrictions. Talk about smoking,
Mm,
talk about tattoos, talk about alcohol,
yeah.
talk about ratings on movies. Of course, you and I are old enough when you go to a movie, you couldn't go unless, your parent was with you or a guardian for an R-rated movie. So these types of restrictions, these types of bills and laws are not new. They're not new. What's new is what they're focused on, and that's social media, and
Mhm.
that's a different animal. But the idea of having parents involved in the decision making, the choices of their children, that's not a brand new thing. And for me, anything that encourages more of parent involvement than less, I'm for.
I like it. Yeah, I like that. So here's who this law in Florida would apply to. Companies will be regulated under this bill if the platform or the internet site allows users to upload content or view the content or activity of other users, satisfy certain daily active user metrics identified in the bill. We may get into that later, we may not. It's a little bit in the weeds about usage time and then what percentage of the users are using it that much time. Now this is an interesting one. Employ algorithms that analyze user data or information on users to select content for users. So really
Yeah.
any platform or internet site that uses AI is going to be regulated by this bill. And if they have certain quote addictive features. Now, this is something that's a little, is the word difficult
It's
to
it's
subjective?
subjective, it's nebulous. You can't define this perfectly.
You can but here's the thing, Mark. When I heard you say a minute ago that the data is empirical or irrefutable about seatbelts, I got to think we're getting close to that with social media, where we have experts in child psychology coming forth and discussing the harms that social media is creating. There's a podcast that I follow. In fact, I was on it as a guest, Mark. It's called Scrolling to Number Two Death. And it's good for parents who want to understand social media better and the dangers of social media better. The host said that 1 out of 10 teenagers has attempted suicide, Mark.
Mhm.
1 out of 10, 10%. That's the highest rate in history, you know? And the contention is that social media is part of that. Okay, so I'm gonna
By the
read.
way,
Yeah.
you will not get an argument from me about that. Listen, I agree 100% that especially for some children, not all, but for certainly for some children, and by the way, adults as well, that the use of social media, the let's put it this way, the immersement in social media. It's like, look, I love sugar. I can eat some of it,
Yeah.
but if I ate a pound a day, I'd be dead in a week.
Yeah.
So it's the immersion of social media on certain children. I think just every individual child, just that it's individual. We all have our own personality traits, our pros, our cons, our strengths, our weaknesses. But for those kids who might be vulnerable in any number of ways, too much of this stuff, I think, absolutely can result in the kind of behavior, the attempted suicide or successful attempted
Mhm.
suicide you're talking about.
So here's the other interesting part of this, and Mark, I'm at a loss as to why this is an issue, or why there's not a simpler solution. Let me put it this way. Commercial now this get there's a it's very wordy up to this point in the paragraph. I'm going to leave that out. What it's describing platforms that have potentially harmful content on them, and how the platform has an obligation to not push that content to people under the age of 18. Such commercial entities must verify using either an anonymous or standard age verification method that the age of a person attempting to access the material harmful to minors satisfies the bill's age requirements. If an anonymous age verification method is used, the verification must be conducted by a non governmental, independent third party organized under the laws of a state of the US. Any information used to verify age must be deleted once the age is verified. Why is that so? Why is the age verification process so complex? Is it a privacy thing, Mark? Or like, why can't we just, is society not ready to issue IDs to 12-year-olds? Or, like, what am I missing on that in a digital age? Aren't we at a time when, I get it, your driver's license used to be your first official ID with a birth date on it, but we all got social security cards from when we were much younger, and our date of birth was like, what is there a reason why we just are pushing back as a society on creating a government-based identification method for teenagers?
Well, it's a great question. Again, I think the difference here, it's not necessarily the sentiment behind various bills, by the way, state and federal. We're talking about Florida, we're talking about KOSA as well. I think the problem is, Bill, even for people like me who would like for identity to be verified as far as usage
Mhm.
based on age, I'm of the opinion that it can all be manipulated because, look, because of this. Listen, identity theft right there. I mean, that's just a prime example. We have all of these multiple factor logons. We all do.
Mhm.
I do everything to your bank account, for this, your credit card, blah, 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 whatever. When we've all been hacked. I don't think there's anybody listening that's over, 20 years old who hasn't had some level of identity fraud. And so, with that being a reality, knowing that every safeguard that you can use is vulnerable to a criminal or criminal organization out there smarter than the safeguards, we have to realize that's true with what identification verification is possible with social media. Now, again, I'm not opposed to it. I'm just saying that it's not the final solution, probably a bad choice of phrases, but it's not the final fix when it comes to uh, uh, confirming the identity of a user. In other words, and he said, why is there a pushback against a federal ID? A federal ID, federal identification. There's some people that tin foil. Maybe I'm one of them a little bit.
Well,
Again, we have a social security
yeah, yeah,
card.
I get it.
So when that was implemented all these years ago, people were afraid, hey, they're going to use this, they're going to come after you because now there's a federal identification. There
Right.
shouldn't be. Probably didn't really happen,
Or a
but
state. I guess I should have said, forgive me, Mark, I probably should have
yeah,
not said federal. I should have said a state issued ID.
yeah,
When
yeah.
people don't have a driver's license in California, they're supposed to have a California ID card.
Yes.
Like, at what age is
Yes,
it,
correct,
like,
correct.
can we do that for people younger than 15, 14, or is it not
Well, we
appropriate?
we probably can. The difference is with a physical ID, like California ID card or California driver's license, or you pick the state, a physical one in your hand, you pick out like here in Florida, which is great last week when I went to vote in the primaries, they wouldn't let me in without an ID. I thought, oh my God, I've died and gone to heaven. So I can't wait to show it. In California, they won't let you. But that's the difference. There's a person looking at your physical ID. Up, okay, yep, you're Mark Garrett. Sign here, put your address down, and go vote. Online, all of that can be manipulated. I don't know if it's effective, and since it can all be manipulated, since it can all be hacked, the more information we put out there, whether you're 60 years old or whether you're 14 years old, I'm not sure it's a good thing. I mean, I understand the idea behind it and the motivation behind it.
Mhm.
I'm just not sure it's practical, and I'm not sure it solves a problem.
I haven't heard of any hacks of, like, state DMV systems. I'm sure it's happened, and I'm sure it's happened, and we probably just
Oh, I
haven't
have.
heard. Oh, you have? Okay.
Oh, yes.
Okay.
Oh,
Okay.
yes.
And so just so people are clear, like, my experience with third-party identification, and I don't know, maybe this is unusual and this isn't the norm, but it was, the government contracts with this particular company to do third-party ID. So I wanna access a particular government website. I have to take a picture of the front and the back of my driver's license and send that to them. I don't know, there was probably a couple other things I had to answer, which probably are cross-checked with my credit report, if I'm remembering right. And then they create a credential for you, and that credential is validated, and I don't know if they destroy the underlying documents, your driver's license, your picture of it, or anything, and they just keep the credential on file. I don't know what the risk is, or, what's gonna be there for people to hack. I don't know, but
Mhm.
that's kind of my experience with third party identification. But I mean, here's why I'm actually there. In my opinion, the one thing that we have to have in any social media bill is some kind of age verification. I don't know how you get there, right? I have a New
Mhm.
Jersey public school education mark. I don't know how we get there, but it has to happen, and it goes to, in the drug space, something that I have called, like, traditional barriers to accessibility. There's beer in every single grocery store in LA County where I live. But what happens when a 13-year-old goes in there and takes a case of beer and puts it on the conveyor belt, right?
Right.
In a modern grocery store, as soon as that item is scanned, the computer locks the conveyor belt, and nothing's going to happen until an ID is scanned. And boop, the ID is scanned, the computer decides if it's appropriate to continue with the sale, and it happens. But yet on social media, we can have a 13-year-old accessing whatever they want because there's no accessibility controls. And I think age verification is the only way to accomplish that. And absent a government ID or some kind of, not federal, I probably shouldn't have said federal, but absent some sort of government ID, I don't know that it's really possible to do that. And maybe it goes to our social security card becoming more than just a card with a number on it. I don't know.
Yeah, it's a tough call, and again, I fully support the sentiment.
Mhm.
I want I do not want a 10-year-old on certain social media sites. And if there's a way that we can do that through age verification, I'm all for it. My concern is that it's more hackable information, it's
Privacy.
more invasion into privacy,
Yep.
and it's not necessarily a very reliable way to do it. Now, again, like you said a minute ago, Bill, about creditors or mortgages, whatever it is, we've all
Mhm.
had to do that. You identify with your ID, and there's some questions, what addresses you live at, and things like this. I understand it. I just think that the legislation, as much as possible, should be focused on the parent's responsibility. In other words, the law should be you are not allowed to allow your 14-year-old or anybody under 14 to be on social media, period. So that eliminates the ID requirement right there because a 14-year-old can't be on, period.
Right.
By the way, partly because of some of the reasons you so well articulated about the suicide rate, how much stress these things placed on children. And the next step is that if you want to be on, that it can only be on with a parent's permission. Um, it's a very complicated thing. I want legislation that puts more responsibility on the parent to know what the hell their kids are doing, and they should be responsible for it. Just as if a parent allowed a child to walk into, again, 20 years ago or 15 years ago, walk into a 7-Eleven and buy beer illegally and knowingly let them do that. They should be held accountable. They
Right.
should be an accessory
Right.
to contribute to the delinquency of a minor. Social media is so scummy now, is so to me, it's so dangerous for young people. I think the parents should be in the same position with that as they are, for my God, for alcohol at least.
Right. Yeah. So I don't know. Let's talk about the federal proposed law, Mark. KOSA, KOSA, the Kids Online Safety Act. Like I said, this I think it was originally introduced in 2022,
Yes.
right?
Was.
And then now this
Uh-huh.
latest version from, as I said earlier, last May. It's been almost a year, still hasn't made it to a vote. I think it probably will now. There's 65 at last count, 65 senators have co-signed on the bill. Interesting that I don't know. Hey, let me say one more thing about the Florida law. And I was trying to
Mhm.
think of it. One thing I think is brilliant about that law, which there's more to this. And like I said, I'm not probably the one to figure that out. But here's what Florida said. They said, they said, if you don't know how old someone is, you have to use your own targeted ad data, or we're going to hold you responsible to your own targeted ad data. Let's say Bill Bodner wants to advertise a product to 14 and 15-year-olds, right? And I go
Mhm.
to you, you're a social media platform, and I say, Mark, I want to advertise this product I have to 14 and 15-year-olds. Whoever you send that ad to, you're responsible. You've now said your algorithm thinks these people are 14 or 15 years old. So
Mm.
you need to
Mhm.
be responsible for the content that you're sending, even if you're claiming you don't know how old they are, but your algorithm is targeting them for an ad that's for a 14 or 15-year-old demographic. So therefore, you think they're 14 or 15 years old. There's something there. You know what I mean? Like, in other words, what the lawmakers were smart enough to do is to say, you might
Yeah.
be saying you don't know how old these people are, but we think you really do know, and you're going to be responsible based on how you're targeting them. Does that make sense?
Well, it makes 100% uh, sense, Bill, because you can see it. I mean, it's not an exact science, even for the social media platforms. They may not know exactly from your viewing habits, but I guarantee you, when I go onto YouTube, any other platform, and I'm looking at, you name it, I'm looking at boats or I'm looking at table saws, whatever,
Mhm.
you can know for sure in 30 seconds, I'm going to get an ad for one of those types of products pop up someplace, right? The same thing is true for my 10-year-old. When when we give him his free time after he reads
Mhm.
25 minutes a day, when he gets the equal time on whatever platform, that as soon as he logs on, there's 4 ads for Lego models popping up because that's what he looks at. So these platforms generally know our ages. They know our interests.
Mhm.
They so the whole thing about well, we don't know whatever. We're going to send this person something inappropriate because we didn't know their age. That's bullcrap.
That's what
I
I'm
don't believe that for an instant.
right.
Now, again, do they know someone's 13 or 15? Yeah, probably not. But do they know generally that this is certainly inappropriate for that kind of age group? They damn well sure do know that.
Exactly, Mark. And I think that's hey, what did you say last show, Mark, or 2 shows ago? If it walks like a duck and talks like a duck, it's a duck. And that's what the lawmakers have said to social media companies. If you're going to target someone with advertisements as if they are 14 or 15 years old, then guess what? We are going to consider them 14 or 15 years old for the purposes of this law.
Yeah,
So, by the way, this isn't a criminal thing. The penalties are civil, but they can be
right.
substantial. I think the law takes effect June 1st. Does that sound right, Mark? June.
You know what?
Yeah. Okay.
I believe you're
But hey,
right.
it hasn't actually
It's
taken
coming up.
effect yet. Coming up. Let's try to go over the federal law too. There's a couple things in the federal law um, that I think are super interesting. The first is, and tell me if I, Mark, if you hear me say something, you're like, no, that's not correct, Bill. Please point it out. I feel like this law, that if it goes through, it will require the platforms to offer a it'll require the platforms offer an opt-out for algorithms. In other words, you'll be able to choose a version of the platform where you're not targeted with things that you might like based on what you watch, etc. Does that sound accurate to what you read?
Yeah, I actually read a summary of it, a couple of days ago. I actually forgot to pull it up here today, so I was looking for it real quick, but that does sound appropriate. And by the way, in in theory, that's an aspect I don't have a problem with in theory.
Yeah. Yeah, here, I found it, Mark. Here's what it says. It says they must make available a version of the platform. If their platform uses algorithms, they must make
Mhm.
available a version of the platforms that do not prioritize information based on your data. So
Correct.
that's
By the way, is there a social media platform that does not utilize algorithms?
no.
This is like almost like a clown show. Why would they even put that
Yeah.
language in there? But basically, man, that's just me.
Yeah. So here's the federal law. The covered platforms must provide minors with certain safeguards, such as settings that restrict access to personal data. I like that, right? They have to provide parents or guardians with tools to supervise minors' use of the platform, such as control of privacy and account settings. That should be the bare minimum. And Mark, you and I talked about a story when we did Snapchat, and we don't know the truth of this allegation, but in the lawsuit against Snapchat that's pending in the plaintiffs kind of made the allegation that as Snapchat updates their software, the engineers
Mhm.
thwart parental monitoring tools. And
Yeah.
man, you cannot have that. You can't have, imagine being a parent and thinking you're doing everything right, Mark, thinking you're monitoring, you have the tools in place, everything's fine, only to find out that there's been a software update and it's made your tools that you actually paid money for, your third party program, useless.
Mhm.
Can't
Yep.
allow that.
Exactly right.
Yeah.
Yep.
What else, Mark? What else on the federal side of, and then maybe we talk real quick about after that, the pros and cons of it and who's actually against it. That sometimes that's telling.
Well, it's interesting, and that latter part, who's against it? I always look at that because to me that really distills things out. As far as as far as the bill itself, it really is similar to the Florida law
Hmm.
in a lot of ways. There's not a tremendous amount of differences in my opinion. I think it's all the same flavor and it all brings the same types of challenges. But if there are a couple of things that you want to hit on
Yeah.
specifically, I'll be happy to comment on them.
Yeah. So
But I do want to talk about who's against it.
okay. So let me hit some pros and cons first and get your thoughts on these, and I'll tell you mine. First
Mhm,
off, the pros of KOSA. The opt-out of algorithm-driven content, I think that's good. I'll
mhm,
just leave it at that. I think that's a positive, that's a necessary part of any
mhm.
legislation. The next one, interesting, duty of care, a duty to act in the best interest of the minor. That's definitely not happening now. One thing I always
Right.
say is like the right now these platforms are their only duty is to maximize shareholder return, right? It's
Yes.
completely a business decision based on maximizing user engagement, which then they monetize and they maximize profits. So right now their whole business model is based on driving engagement, and now the government's going to put on them a duty to act in the best interest of minor. That's something that I think is a positive. Restricting content based on age or age verification, there is no age verification written into this law, and again, I don't know, I struggle with that one because I think that's an important part of any bill. I feel like there has to be age verification, but as I said, I don't know how to accomplish it.
Correct.
Yeah.
And that's my thing. Again, I'm all for the sentiment. I'm all for, philosophically, I'm supportive of age verification. I'm just not sure how it's done effectively, knowing that these platforms, these organizations try at every turn to thwart those types of safeguards.
And finally, the final pro I see is just a general one. It increases the liability that's on the platforms. That's going
Yep.
to be the only way we get them to invest
I
in a
agree.
safer experience for children. Right
Hmm.
now, when a lawyer for a platform can meet with a group of parents and literally tell the parents, "Hey, Section 230 protects us from this. Like, you can't sue us because we're immune." We can't have
Yeah.
that. It's a product. They've created a product that's really almost like a living, breathing, thinking product. And if it's harming kids, they got to take responsibility for it. So I think that's an important
Yes.
one. The cons. And to me, as I said, I support KOSA. I support doing something, but some of these things bother me, Mark, and I don't know. I don't know I don't know how we get around them. Content restriction versus design restriction. So right now, where it stands is like one of the features, like design features, right? The law is based a lot on design features, and they name these design features that they question, like endless scrolling is one of them, right? Meaning that if you're looking
Mhm.
through short
Right.
videos, you could literally keep looking forever, ever, and it'll keep suggesting a short video to you. Now, if the law says you can't ban specific content, but it says you can target it, but if certain design flaws are being used to push that content, then you can go after it. Would that not be used as, in other words, couldn't you use this part of the law to target specific content that you don't like? If you're a state attorney general and your political views are A, B, and C, you can't just say you can't put that stuff on your platform, but you can say, well, you're using this endless scrolling to show that content, and that's been deemed to be an addictive design flaw of your program. So we're going to go after you civilly for using that design flaw to push that content that we don't like.
Yes, I agree. In other words, for one person or one entity to decide what content is acceptable, what is not, what's appropriate, what's inappropriate for a certain age, look, it's almost impossible. It's almost impossible. Period. Now, again, uh, we've had it for almost ever in our society with very narrow, specific examples. Again, certain content in movies where you have to have your parent or a guardian walk into a theater. Again, that's kind of passe now going to theaters, but you get my point. Because of the content, because of violence, of sexual nature, of language, things like this, they have different ratings. Those ratings come from a private entity, by the way, that rates these movies. But with social media, it because it's infinite, it's literally infinite,
Hmm.
infinite the amount of information that any person, adult or child, can view, can listen to on the internet. This is why I think that, again, it comes back to parent involvement. If there's a way to implement age verification. By the way, I thought, Bill, I could be wrong. I thought that age verification was still a part of KOSA. I could be wrong on that. If you're sure
No,
about that,
I
let me
don't
know.
know. Like, I really couldn't
Yeah,
find anything that talked about how they were going to implement it, though.
yeah. And, it right, and that's always the question, same question I have, how do you actually implement it? I would love for, and by the way, so this goes back to the amount of information that anybody can view on the internet. So, where does it stop? Where does it begin as far as what's appropriate for a 14-year-old? That's why the parent involvement say, "Hey, you're only 13, you're only 15, whatever it is, you're not gonna be in social media, period."
Mhm.
Or if there is a way to verify someone's age, I don't know what it is effectively, I'm fine with that too. And that's one of the things I wanna talk about when we get to it, about who actually supports you, who doesn't
Yeah.
support, this
Let me
bill.
add one thing before we get there, Mark. It just goes back
Mhm,
to the design features. The way it's termed in the law is design features that cause harm. So if you're
mhm.
pushing content with that's inappropriate with design features that cause harm, there's a problem. And two of the design features, one is endless scrolling, which we talked about, and the second, believe it or not, or a second, not the second, a second, believe it or not, is notifications. If the
Mhm.
platform
Wow.
has the
Mhm,
ability to send you notifications,
mhm,
that's considered a design feature that can cause harm. And then, I saw a very relevant point brought up that says if an online, and this is from something by the Electronic Frontier Foundation, who, by the way, they are very against the Kids Online Safety Act, and they're probably, I don't know who funds them. I shouldn't even speculate, but they're against
mhm.
it. But here's an example they use. If an online service presented an endless scroll of math problems for children to complete, or rewarded children with virtual stickers and other prizes for reading digital children's books, would lawmakers consider those design features harmful?
Well, you know what? Once they find me that website, I'll answer their question.
That's a great point. And,
I
hey,
mean,
that's a great.
they're so full of manure
Yeah,
to even we all know it's, I guess you could go to a specific website for something like that, but not involving continuous scrolling. In other words, that this doesn't happen. It's such a disingenuous, I'll put in quotes, argument.
Yeah. So one more thing on pros and cons. The other con I see, Mark, and then we'll talk about who's not supporting it, who's supporting it.
Mhm.
The government determines what is harmful or what type of information can be shared. And this is, could state attorneys general use this to enact political agendas in different
Of
states?
course.
Yeah. And that's, I don't like that. I don't like that. But again,
No, I don't like it either.
it's not a perfect system, but I feel like we have to do something. So Mark, I
Mhm.
mentioned the electronic, what did I say it was? Who was that one? That was the Electronic Frontier Foundation.
Oh,
Yes. The
there was
Electronic
another
Frontier
one.
Foundation, they
Okay.
are against KOSA. Who else is out there, Mark, that's not supporting this?
Well, it comes as no surprise to me, the ACLU.
I saw that.
Yeah, did you read that? And there's a couple of points in here, that there's a couple of arguments, I say points, that they make. But one of them is so interesting to me. I don't even understand what they mean by this. And it says requiring or incentivizing age verification chills speech for adults and minors. And bear with me, it's just one short paragraph.
Mhm.
KOSA continues to require that platforms treat minors differently from adults. Stop. This is in the middle of a sentence.
Yeah,
Duh.
right.
I mean, this is the argument, and I'm going to finish this, but I want people oops, I want people to hear this, that the ACLU is upset because the KOSA bill, by their own statement, treats minors differently from adults.
Yep.
That should sink into everybody. Yes, it does, which could necessitate that platforms verify users' ages. These age verification schemes would not only impact minors, who could lose access to vital online resources, but also implicates the First Amendment rights of adults. I have no idea what they're talking about when it comes to First Amendment rights for adults. Age verification threatens adult speech and online privacy by denying individuals the ability to
Right.
browse the web anonymously, which may deter them from browsing at all. Finally, it also increases the risk that users' personal identity information may be subject to do a data breach. Now, that last one, of course,
I heard you say that.
early on in
Yeah,
this
yeah,
conversation,
yeah,
I agree with.
yeah.
The other 90% of this paragraph, I think, is not only it's incoherent,
Yeah.
but it's also frightening that the ACLU is upset about any potential legislation that would treat minors differently than adults. Bill, ladies and gentlemen, this is my underlying concern about all this legislation. When I say concern, I really kind of like lack of any legislation is what concerns me. But any legislation about this when it comes to minors and social media should all be primarily, not exclusively, but primarily focused on parent involvement because we all do and should treat children differently than adults. If we didn't, we'd have more children committing suicide and being placed in harm's way every single day. Our job as parents, as adults in society, is to protect children from certain behaviors and certain individuals and certain entities that want to exploit them. And for the ACLU to be pissed off, that's what we should be doing as a society. It's absolutely sickening to me.
Yep.
So, because they're opposed to it, yeah, I'm in support of some level of legislation right there.
Yeah,
And that's all I'll say about opposition.
no, that's well said. And here's what they said, which I disagree with just as you do. They said the First Amendment should apply to all people equally, adults or minors. End of story. That's what their argument is. I don't think that's appropriate. The second thing is when they
Agreed.
say that by restricting the experience for children, they're affecting the First Amendment rights of adults. That makes no sense to me. That's almost like because
It,
you're preventing, I guess the argument is, let me start by saying it that way. I guess the argument is you're suppressing their message because you're not allowing them to communicate with minors. Tough luck.
tough luck.
Tough luck.
Like you said, Bill, like I said a minute ago, this passage I read from them, it's incoherent.
Yeah.
Yes, I agree with you 100% on this.
So our message to people is get involved. It starts in the home with parents. If your children are on social media educate yourselves. And understand that the experience that you have on social media platforms is very different than the experience of a teenager, and that is purposeful. Educate yourself about this KOSA bill, decide if you support it or don't support it, and use your voice to make things safer for children. Mark, anything else?
No, it's been a fun and very important
Yeah.
conversation. I know
And
it's not the last one.
we may be there may be a children online safety event on April 11th in the LA area, and we may do something live from that, Mark. Stay tuned, people, and we'll update you as it gets closer. Thanks everyone for joining us today. Be safe on the internet.